Hi, this is Dr. Kimberley Linert, author of Visualizing Happiness in Every Area of Your Life and host of this podcast, Incredible Life Creator. And today, my guest is Miss Jillian Deamer. Hey, Jillian.
Hello, how are you today, Kimberly?
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Just so people
Thanks
can
for
get to
having
know
me.
you, I'm just going to read your bio.
Okay.
Jillian Deamer is a narcissistic abuse recovery and spiritual life coach. She was raised by a narcissistic, psychologically, and emotionally abusive mother and was trapped in the abuse cycle for nearly 4 decades. She has a deep understanding of the healing and recovery process. During her healing journey, she discovered that one cannot talk their way out of pain. The trauma runs deep. It is because of this, Jillian uses an integrative, trauma informed approach to help her clients heal their mind, body, and spirit and reclaim their lives after abuse. As a firm believer in post traumatic growth, Jillian is a living example that one can go on to have a better life because of their trauma. All right. Well, tell us about you, how you started out, and this already kind of told us how you started out, but to tell us your story.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I would say my story probably really started in about 2015 when I realized I married my mother. And I didn't know at that time that my mother was psychologically and emotionally abusive and definitely had narcissistic traits because it's just not really well known, that type of abuse. So, when you're being physically abused, when you're being sexually abused. But when it's psychological and emotional, if that's all you don't realize the situation you're in. And then I noticed that my ex-husband at the time was doing very similar things as my mother. And him and I started to see a couples counselor. And I think we only went to 2 sessions together. And then I started seeing her by myself. And that's when it was really brought to my attention what I went through in childhood. And I just didn't know that was the reason that I was feeling the way I was feeling. Like I was dealing with severe depression, which I also didn't know because that was my normal state, probably since I was about 6 years old. So I was dealing with that and anxiety. And when I told her the different things that my mother did, she looked at me and she said, really with your upbringing, you really should be addicted to crack and have multiple children from different dads. You should not be living the life that you're even living now. And she said I was on the brink of having a nervous breakdown because here I was in the abuse cycle for more than about 40 years at that point. And so I started working with her, and I really struggled with it at first because I thought my mother was the crazy one. Like, why am I seeing a therapist? And so but I saw her, and thank God I did. Like, it really kind of jump started me on my own healing journey. So I got divorced from my ex, and then I thought, okay, I left that situation. I'm healed. Everything's going to be fine. And I was just doing, like I said, talk therapy with that therapist. And after a few years and more bad, sometimes toxic relationships, and one of them ended very abruptly, and I made the stupid decision to move in with somebody I barely knew, like basically 2 weeks after I met him, because that really seemed like a good idea at the time. And that really scared me that I did that. And I realized I felt like he was trying to suffocate me alive, almost like he was just very like clingy, and I just wasn't allowed to have a life of my own, and he just had to be by my side constantly unless I was at work. And so I left that relationship like 6 months after it started. And then I decided to get serious about my healing journey. I was like, I'm the common denominator in all of these situations and relationships. Like, there's something about me. So I decided I was going to quadruple down on my healing journey at the end of 2019, which worked out perfectly because I was already claiming 2020 before 2020 was a thing. Like, it was perfect. I was like locked in my apartment basically by myself to like focus on all this. I was doing like 80 to 100 hours of work on myself each month on average. Like, I was serious. Like, I've got to figure this out. And the more I was doing the work on myself, I came across trauma in the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, I believe is his name is. And It was so eye-opening to me. I mean, we don't realize the impact that trauma and abuse has on our nervous system and how it affects the brain and how it affects our limiting beliefs, which, you know, basically create the life that we live. And when I found out about trauma and learning about dysregulated nervous system and how I was trying to self-soothe with things, as far as I can remember, like, I mean, I started drinking really early in life. I mean, I was probably 15 maybe, and then I did do drugs for a few years, and that's shopping addictions, and I would just kind of jump from like addiction to addiction, and I definitely think relationships were one of them. And it made so much sense when I learned about trauma and how it impacts the body, and that how that's really where the healing needs to take place, and it really does change everything.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot to
Yeah.
take in.
Yeah. And I guess I should also say too, like during my healing journey, it's like doors started opening up for me that year. Like all of a sudden I was led to all these certifications, and they were all trauma informed. And some of the classes I was in the first cohort. So it's almost like they were there waiting on me to start. So that's what got me really interested in it.
Oh, cool. So, um, just so listeners that might not know exactly, they probably heard the word narcissistic, but you know, there's so many definitions it seems like around narcissistic. People might even use it as a as a slur or name calling when they're mad at somebody. But what really is the actual clinical narcissistic pattern or characteristics or things? So let's say there's other people that they're in the same situation you were and you didn't even know you were in it. So what kind of things should we look for?
Yeah, I definitely do think narcissism and narcissist is thrown around pretty generously lately nowadays. Like anybody that's self-centered or egotistical, like, oh, they're a narcissist. And yes, that could be part of narcissism. And somebody could be a grandiose narcissist where, you know, everything is about them and they are very self-absorbed and selfish. But where I like to think, more like along the lines of narcissistic traits. So when someone is psychologically and emotionally abusive, when someone's controlling and manipulating and gaslighting and making you question your reality and just not letting you be you in the relationship, like it's all about them in the relationship, like and they can be sometimes very vicious, like especially the more malignant ones. They can be very evil, and they can be more physically abusive, financially abusive, and sexually abusive as well. So it's actually a clinical term, narcissistic personality disorder, which has to be diagnosed by a psychiatrist or a psychologist. But most narcissists aren't going to go see a psychologist or psychiatrist anyways, because they don't think anything's wrong with them. So yeah, there are people that are quote true narcissists that could match all these symptoms to diagnose, but then there's a lot of people that have narcissistic traits. But I also like to say it's kind of the buzzword for emotional and psychological abuse.
Mhm. So I'm just trying to kind of separate the difference between like a parent and child, like the parent's narcissistic and the child's being abused, as opposed to maybe one-on-one relationship with a, husband, wife, or whatever. So what, because as a child, I'm thinking, when you're a baby, 1 years old, 2 years old, I mean, basically all your care is dependent on the parent. I mean, your needs are met by the parent. So what does that look like?
Yeah, a psychological and emotionally abusive person is dangerous regardless of who it's towards. But I believe it's actually more dangerous when it's a parent-child relationship, because you're developing, and before the age of 7, I mean, you're living in a theta brainwave state. So you're just absorbing everything. So you don't realize that all these things that this person's making you feel and believe about yourself, that they're not true. And you realize that this narcissistic parent, it's really all about them. It's all about their needs. The world revolves around them. So if you're a child and you have needs, your needs aren't nearly as important or important at all compared to your parents, and they can't deal with your emotions. If you're needing like emotional support, they can't give it to you. Like they don't have the capacity to give it to you. So what happens is, especially before the age of 7, when you realize that, wait a minute, I'm not safe to be me, and I'm not safe to express myself around this primary caregiver, this person's not emotionally there for me, and you realize like subconsciously you're in danger. And so your nervous system gets triggered into that fight flight response, and it just stays there growing up. So that's how you get stuck in depression and stuck in anxiety.
So, so these narcissistic parents are having children,
Mm-hmm.
whether they choose or not, because sometimes things, we just have children. Um, but let's say there's a narcissistic parent, they want a child, they choose to have a child. How do they view that child as far as how does the child benefit them? You know what I'm asking?
Yes, the child benefits them because they see it as either an extension of themselves to live the lives that maybe they wish they could have lived. So they live vicariously through the child, and the child has to meet those demands and can't have a life of their own. Another reason would be that they enmesh with their child. So the child isn't allowed to have their own personality. Like the child has to cater to the parents' needs. That's another big characteristic too, is the child is very concerned about caretaking, about being like, the child is just all about making sure that the parents' needs are met. And so a lot of times too, that the parent looks at the child as almost more of a possession, not necessarily a child. Like I feel like my own mother looked at me like I was a doll, like a doll baby, like that I wasn't like a real human being. And my mother used me as a pawn when she divorced my dad. So that's very common too, that the narcissistic parent will try to turn the child against the other parent if they separate or get divorced.
And what happens, we all go through the teenage years when the child all of a sudden wants to have their own thoughts, their autonomy. Whether it's in middle school or high school, that time when most kids start to rebel.
Yeah.
So what happens during that time? Does the parent just smash on the kid and not let them, or what happens there?
Pretty much that's what happens. I know in my case, my mother became even more controlling and more chaotic and out of control and scarier. Like I remember around that time, she would just start coming into my room and just screaming and yelling at me about God knows what, and just taking like clothes out of my closet and things that were important to me and just smashing them to the ground, and having these just rages out of nowhere and saying, you're looking differently, you're acting differently, you're not treating me well. And she would say all these things while she's just destroying my room, and then she would leave, and I was grounded all the time. She would try to control who my friends were, who I was going to go out with. Before I was going to leave for college, she would come into my room in the middle of the night and just start shaking me awake and just yelling at me about whatever for 2 hours every night. And supposedly she had no recollection of doing any of that when I talked to her years later about it. But yeah, they get a lot more controlling and possessive if they feel like you're trying to drift away from them, because part of their identity becomes wrapped up in you.
Got it. So as you're getting older, it seems like it naturally they would get more and more stressed out,
Yes.
worried about the fact that you're moving away from them, or that you're having your own thoughts, or that you're basically smart enough to know that, hey, it's time for me to move out. Um, wow.
Yeah, I had to basically run away from home. I had just finished high school, it's my graduation, and my mother got involved in this Pentecostal church around my senior year in high school. And so she was on mission to quote, save everybody. And so she invited a bunch of family members down to my graduation, not to come to my graduation, but to get saved at the church. And so when she went to take them back to the airport is when I left. So I kind of planned my escape because I really didn't believe she was going to let me leave. I mean, I really didn't.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's switch gears over to like let's say an intimate relationship, or I guess it could even be best friend relationships, like two girlfriends, in other words, it could be like a marriage relationship, or it could even be a friend relationship. How does that look? Because then you have two adults.
You have two adults. Yeah. So one of the things, I mean, about being in a relationship, say an intimate relationship with a narcissist, is that there's a couple of things. They do a lot of things called like triangulation, where they kind of pit you against another, say, woman, or, if it's a woman, they put two men together and you're kind of like competing for the narcissist. This kind of happens in the beginning. And then also in the beginning of the relationship too, they love bomb you. I mean, they shower you with everything that you've ever wanted to hear. They buy you presents. They give you like everything that you've ever wanted. And it's just, you feel like on cloud nine. And, they'll say things like, oh, I believe you're my soulmate and I love you. And they'll say it really early. And when you're starved for love, like, especially when you come from an abusive childhood and you want that love, like that's a lot of times the type of people that gravitate towards the narcissist, and the narcissist gravitates towards, because once they reel you in and get you hooked, then all of a sudden it changes. But then you're always trying to get that other person back to how they were in the beginning, like the very loving, just showering you with attention and being there. But then that never comes back. It may come back for a day or a couple days or something after you get into a fight or something like that. But then it goes right back to how it was. And it's just, they're very manipulative in relationships. The relationship is all about them. Like, again, you can't have any needs and they expect you to take care of all their needs. And when I say needs, I'm talking a lot about emotional needs as well. Like, they're not going to support you. Like, I remember, and my mother would do the same thing, and my ex-husband would do this. Like, whenever something good was happening for me, they would try to sabotage it. And they would pick a fight like the day before. Like, you had to stay always like one step lower than them at least. And so you can never outshine them, ever. So and that happens with friends too. Like, if you're friends with a narcissist, you can't outshine them. You'll kind of notice like conversations are always really one-sided. They don't really care about you as a person or what's going on with you. And it's just always about them.
Mm-hmm. And not sure how to ask this question. How about like honesty, trustworthiness? Are they constantly saying lies to try and reel you in? Can you trust them?
You can't trust them at all. They will, of course, mix in truth, because obviously that is more believable, right? Like, if you sprinkle in a little bit of truth into the lie, then it makes it way more believable than if it was just a total lie. And they'll tell you what you want to hear, and say, what usually happens when you're in a relationship with a narcissist or any type of abusive person, you normally end up what's called like this drama triangle, right? And so you have the perpetrator on the top, and then you have the victim on the other side, and then you have the rescuer, right? So the rescuer is always trying to rescue the perpetrator, like trying to like save them or make them change, or make them see the error of their ways, which they can't. Like, they can't see that they're even doing anything wrong, and they can't hear you and they can't see you. So whenever that balance gets disrupted, then the other person will swing to victim. And then they'll blame like the rescuer for abusing them. Like they'll turn around and say, no, you're the one that's abusive and you're abusing me because they weren't getting their way and you're calling them out on it and you're fighting with them. And then you just kind of keep going around this triangle, like until someone finally decides to leave the relationship. So either the quote victim gets strong enough to get out, or the abuser finds another source of supply and leaves.
Okay. So you just said something that stood out to me. They need another source. So do they always need someone else to be, I don't know if you want to say it, feeding off of, but they
Yes.
always need to have another person in their life to.
Yeah. 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 They really are like energy vampires. Like they'll drain you of everything. They'll drain you of everything they can get from you, whether it's emotional, psychological, physical, financial. Like I know a lot of people that have just been financially ruined by these people. They take everything.
So do these narcissistic people, do they ever get help? Do they ever get healed?
I don't want to say never because I don't ever believe in never, but it's highly unlikely.
And is it because they think they're always right?
Yeah, yeah, they
Everybody
don't
else,
have a problem.
they don't have a problem.
Yeah, you
Everybody
have
else
the
has a
problem.
problem.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So basically, if something goes wrong, they're blaming somebody else.
yeah, yeah.
It's never their fault.
Never their fault. No, no, and they're gonna gravitate, like I said, towards people that are more codependent. Definitely people pleasers. Uh, I mean, those two are probably the two most vulnerable groups of people that an abusive person is going to go after.
So let's say you find yourself in this triangle with a narcissist, and you said, the person who is in that relationship, they have to have the power to get out. Do a lot of times, do they need some kind of support or people to help them, or how do they get out of these relationships?
Yeah, it's definitely hard to get out of these relationships because the thing is, a lot of times you're trauma bonded to this person, like your core wounds of I'm not enough, I'm not worthy, or attached to this person because in the very beginning, this person made you feel enough, they made you feel worthy. And also, a lot of times, if you are a codependent or people pleaser, you came from abusive childhoods. So these people are familiar to you. And so it feels very comfortable and safer, believe it or not, to be in this type of relationship than being with somebody that's healthy and can have a good relationship. So one of the first steps to getting out of one of these types of relationships is to first realize that you're in it. Because a lot of times people don't realize it because, again, it could be their normal. Like I didn't know for years until I finally went and saw a therapist. Like I said, that was my couples counselor first. And I remember she recommended this book called The Human Magnet Syndrome by Ross Rosenberg, which is an excellent read. Like if you think that you may be codependent or a narcissist, that's like a really good place to start. It really gives you a lot of context, like for what you're going through. So then find a supportive person, whether it's supportive therapist, supportive coach, have someone that knows the steps to get out, because it's definitely multifaceted. Like there's a lot of grieving work, a lot of healing work that needs to be done, and a lot of reconnection to the self that needs to be done. So start working with that. Also start building up your support network. Because a lot of times these people take you away from all your whole support network. They cause problems with you and your family. They cause people problems with you and your friends. And they try to isolate you because the more isolated you are, the more controllable you are. So if that has happened to you, then start building that network. Like if you're want to join a church or some type of like meetup group or some type of social group, just try to meet people and start building up your supportive network that way and reconnect with old friends. And then make sure you're financially sound that you can get out. Like maybe you got to start hiding some money and saving money before you can make an escape. And I would also recommend talking to a lawyer in your area and see like what resources are available to you.
Got it. So can it sometimes be dangerous to leave that situation since that person doesn't want you to leave?
It can be dangerous. It depends on the severity of the narcissism. Because, like I said, there's people that with narcissistic traits. It's on a spectrum, right? So, if people on one end of the spectrum, yeah, they're a little selfish and self-absorbed, and they might not really care too much about other people, but they're not really necessarily abusive, right? Like you can be selfish and self-absorbed, but not abusive. And then you have people that are abusive, whether it's psychologically and emotionally. But then you also have these people like malignant narcissists. They do have the potential that they could seriously injure you or even kill you if you try to leave. And so you have to know what you're dealing with. And that's why it's really helpful to talk to someone that knows about narcissism and can kind of guide you and kind of figure out, maybe help you figure out exactly what type of situation you're in. And then that's also another good time too. If you have a malignant narcissist, I would definitely contact like a local women's shelter, or if you're a man and you're married to a narcissist, like even like maybe a church group or something. But yeah, definitely have like that support network to leave. You got to be safe. Your safety is the number one priority.
So let's say you realize that you either were raised by a narcissist or you've been in a narcissistic relationship or relationships. How do you work with people? Kind of give me an idea, like what can they expect? Because I'm sure, whenever we come for any kind of treatment or therapy, we're a little bit, nervous about that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the way that I work with people is like I do a lot of psych education. So they understand a lot of like how the brain works and the nervous system works, and how a lot of it's a chemical addiction, and how the trauma bond forms, and how, the brain is just trying to keep you safe. And, they find a familiar situation, even if it's an abusive situation, safer than being in a healthy relationship. So just kind of understanding that. So that way you can start showing yourself some compassion and grace during this healing journey, and really understanding by taking that step to get help. I mean, it just shows how much strength you have, because a lot of times people don't want to face, right? Like their inner demons and what's going on with themselves. So, and then we really get to familiar with their nervous system. Like, how is their nervous system working? Like, what triggers are happening? Like, what core wounds are showing up? And how to develop healthy practices to get out of those states of, like, say, fight, flight, and fawn freeze, and stay more in like a calm, centered, peaceful state. And so we'll do a lot of that work. And then also we'll use a lot of somatic approaches to heal, like, say, childhood trauma, if that exists, which it normally does. If you end up in a narcissistic abusive relationship as an adult, you were definitely more prone to have a narcissistic or abusive childhood. So we'll kind of work on that and start changing a lot of those core wounds and limiting beliefs, and then really start developing their own sense of self, because the abuse severs the connection to the self. And a lot of times, whether it's when you leave an abusive childhood or an abusive relationship as an adult, you don't know who you are. Like, you just feel like a shell of yourself. You don't have just any connection to things that you don't like what you're available for, what you're not available for, and just learning what your values are, what your needs are. Identifying needs is huge, and honoring those needs, because sometimes it's as simple as, people are hungry and they ignore it, and then they go 5 hours before they eat something. Like, it's like we have to start like listening to our bodies. Like, if our body needs rest, and we have to give it rest, and that's just part of just a healthy lifestyle. It's just starting to meet those needs. And then also we'll do boundary work, and just kind of position people in the right place around you in your life, because sometimes we let people too close that really shouldn't be that close to us, and just keep them in right perspective.
Yeah.
We'll do all
So
kinds of work like
if someone, they're going through the therapy and they're starting to heal, and they're starting to feel like, oh, I actually know what I like now. I know what I would like to have, but they've had a history of being in, 3 or 4 narcissistic relationships. How do they know which one feels right? How do they find those safe, healthy people? Because they've
yeah.
had, they're kind of tuned to the other people.
Right. I definitely will help some of my clients when they start dating again. Um, because there is things to watch out for. And sometimes too, like if you come from an abusive childhood and you've been in abusive relationships your whole adult life, like if you feel chemistry with somebody right away, it's not a good thing. Because that's your nervous system recognizing something very familiar about that person. So it's better to go slow, and to look for more, you know, a lot of times, like I said, people tell you what they want to hear, what you want to hear, right? So if you're on a date and say you're with a narcissist, a lot of times they'll, tell you what they want to hear, tell you what you want to hear, and then they'll start maybe talking about all this grand stuff about themselves, but they're not really sharing anything of depth, right? It's just kind of very superficial conversation, and they kind of paint this like this dream life that you could have with them, and there's just no substance. It's really like having more of the conversations with people, like really getting to know them, really getting to know their character, what their needs are, what their values are, what their standards are. And it's important for the client to also have standards, because otherwise you're just kind of dating whoever shows up, right?
Right.
And that's not always a good thing. It's good to be able to say no, right? Not
Yeah.
for me. Yeah.
And do you have, I don't know, certain important questions you might ask somebody when you're first getting to know them that would give you clues?
I definitely want to ask questions like, what was their childhood like? What was their relationship with their mother like, their father like? What were early relationships like? What are some adult relationships, especially their most recent? If they were married, what was that marriage like? And the other person, how did they get out of it? What was the divorce like? And just also, asking them too, it's like, how do you normally feel like on average? Like, are you depressed? Are you dealing with anxiety? Like, and what is it that they really want to know or learn or achieve by working with me? So, what are their goals?
Okay. Wow. So, when you're working with people, um, and they have these limiting beliefs, how do you help them work through that where they're actually able to see, first of all, see what it is, but then make that change?
That's the shift. And that's the first part of the shift for sure, is to be aware of what the belief is, and then start looking for evidence of the opposite. So, supporting evidence. So, say, you know, maybe my belief is I'm not enough, which is kind of like a big limiting belief. So you start looking for evidence, like in different parts of the person's life where they were enough. And you start kind of building up that confidence and that support of the belief, like, wait a minute, I was enough in this situation, enough in that situation. And you start like realizing, like, wait. And after a while, like once you start finding all these examples in multiple areas of your life, like you start to shift that belief. You're like, wait a minute, maybe as a child, I decided on this faulty belief that I'm not enough because of whatever happened to me as a child. But as an adult, like it's just, I realize that's not true. So.
I'm not at a loss for questions, but right now I'm thinking, is there anything else that we should know about how you work with people or how they would experience that or what they would experience going through the treatment?
Yeah, I think the way I work with people is definitely a very mindful approach. Like I really want the person to connect to themselves, like reconnect to themselves. And I really want my clients to really build a healthy relationship with their self, because I do 100% believe it's the blueprint to all other relationships. So if you don't know yourself, like a lot of times I'll hear people, they don't want to be alone. Like they don't want to sit in their apartment alone or home alone. Um, because there really is no one home, including them. They're not even home, right? Like with themselves, like they've self-abandoned. They don't want to listen to like what their feelings, they're not comfortable with their feelings and what their inner experience is. I just want people to return home to themselves, because that's really going to positively ripple out to all areas of your life. once you have that reconnection.
Wow. Without, we have, of course, patient privacy, but without saying any names or anything, can you give me an example of someone you worked with and kind of what the result was?
Yeah, I think there's, you know, one of my clients, she came from an abusive childhood. She had couple abusive relationships as an adult. And now she's with someone that's very loving, but also someone that she can kind of keep at a distance, right? Because sometimes that closeness and intimacy is very uncomfortable for someone that has an abusive background. But she didn't have really any idea of really what brought her joy. And she was always in a very anxious state, and she didn't know how to get out of this anxious state. Like, she probably was in anxiety maybe 75% of the time when we first met, which is a lot. And I was able to get her down, after just a few months of working with her, down to about 40% anxiety. But she was starting to get a lot of excitement and passion again for life, because we're really able to identify different things that she could do that brought her joy, and give herself permission to do those things. Because a lot of times people don't feel like they have permission to be happy in life, that they don't have permission to feel peace in life. So sometimes that's a key part too, is to realize that it's okay for me to be happy.
Yeah. And that just made me think of another question. So, we talked about the narcissistic parent and then the child who's being abused. What about when that child grows up, starts having their own family? Let's say they're actually in a healthy relationship. They start having their own family. What happens in that parenting relationship when they start having their own kids?
It can go one of three ways. One is they decide to not even have children because they're scared and they don't want the children to go through what they went through, which is the choice I made. Now that I've done all my healing work, I kind of wish I made a different choice, but it felt like the right choice at the time. The second choice is they have kids and they're terrified still of being like their parents. So they make a conscious effort to do everything completely opposite as their parent. But the problem with that is it's almost like a different kind of control, right? Because it's like, okay, I need my kids to have this great life and be happy and feel at peace. So then say their kid isn't happy for whatever reason that day, like they get so stressed and anxious because they're like, oh my God, my kid's not happy and I wanted to be happy. And so they're just kind of trying to control their home environment to make sure it stays as peaceful as possible and as loving as possible, which is definitely coming from good intentions, right? But we're human and there's a whole spectrum of emotions and things that we have to feel. And then the other thing is, like, there are the people that are raised by narcissists that become narcissists themselves. And so they're just going to keep repeating the cycle.
Okay. Wow. So, if people wanted to get more information or they wanted to work with you, just tell us about, what you have available as far as programs and where to contact you.
Yeah, they can find me at jilliandeamer.com. I do have a program called Reconnect, because like I said, I firmly believe in the reconnection to the self and building that relationship. And that is a 4-month program. It's 8 sessions. So we meet every other week, but there's work to do in between each session. So it's kind of an intensive. And that's all about, like I said, reconnecting to the self. And in that program, we will work on identifying different parts of yourself that are showing up, say like people pleasing and perfectionism or codependency, things like that, and work and transform them. We'll identify your needs, we'll identify boundaries and your values, and kind of start healing some of the wounds too, like I'm not enough, I'm not worthy. And we'll also work on your trauma timeline. So doing a trauma timeline is it definitely gives you a lot of insight to, okay, everything now makes sense. This is what happened to me, and this is the way it impacts the brain and nervous system. So it definitely allows a lot more space for self-compassion. So that's my Reconnect program. And then if you didn't want to do a program, but just want to work with me on just rebuilding your life and working towards your goals and maybe identifying needs and self-care and things like that, just anything you'd want to work on, I have spiritual life coaching sessions, and you can purchase 1 or 3 or do a package of 5. So those are 2 main ways right now to work for me.
Beautiful. So no, just to ask you a personal question,
Yeah.
what gives you the most happiness and fulfillment at this point in your life?
Oh my gosh. I think right now, I mean, I'm so grateful that I was led to my life purpose. I mean, it's just, I'm very passionate about helping other people just really understand, like I said, their nervous system and how their mind works, and how it's just, it really couldn't be any other way. Like if you have childhood trauma, like if you're struggling with addictions and things like that, it's just, it's actually pretty natural from what you dealt with. So that brings me a lot of joy. And also just spending time with my family and friends and my little dog. I love my little dog, Lucy. She's not in my office with me right now, but yeah, she just brings me so much joy. Like I just love walking in nature. And it's just, I've noticed that the more I heal, like this more simple and peaceful my life is, like that's what really brings me joy.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And
Yeah.
thank you for all your wisdom and information on this, so people can, recognize if this might be happening to them or someone they know. So thank you so much for being on the
Thank you, Kimberly.
podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. So I have one last question before we finish.
Okay.
What is your best advice on living an incredible, amazing life?
My best advice is, like I said, to reconnect to yourself, have a healthy relationship with the self, and don't get entangled in other people's dramas. Just stay in your lane.
I love that. Stay in your lane.
Yeah, stay in your lane.
Well, thank you so much, Jillian.
Thank you, Kimberly.
We'll talk to you again soon.
Okay, bye.